Hello and welcome to Japan Expert Insights and our Wednesday morning room with Tim Sullivan and me, Maya Matsuoka, as your hosts and moderators. In this podcast, we welcome comments, questions, and opinions. So if you haven't done so yet, join us next time on Clubhouse. In the meantime, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload all the conversations on Japanese politics, business insights, and Japan's role in the Indo-Pacific region. Good morning, everybody. It's 8 o'clock on Wednesday morning, the time when we open our room. And we have, again, a special guest today, Alvin Tan. I'm sure that you already know him from his articles in the Japonica publication. He's an editor there, and he writes about Japan, business in Japan, and other topics. Very well researched articles with solutions, because Alvin doesn't write only about problems, he writes also about solutions. So today we're here to talk about Japanese companies that mandate English as their language, whether you should do that or not. And I'm sure that there are many different opinions on this topic. We all have ours. But I would like to hear Alvin first, and after that, we'll invite you to join us here on stage or share your thoughts in the room chat. So please get ready with them. And Alvin, once again, thank you for coming, and shall we start?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Maya, and thanks, Tim, for the introduction. And I think today, I think it's going to be a very interesting topic because I can just kind of share the background behind this topic. It's just a couple of weeks ago, I wrote this article, which was titled kind of a little bit. I wanted to have this spark kind of a discussion on LinkedIn and other social media channels. So I called it "Why Japanese Companies Going English Must." It's just plain silly. And the subtitle is "Imposing a Blanket Policy Forcing Everyone in the Company to Communicate in English is a Pointless and Misguided Move." And I was pretty impressed, or kind of I was surprised actually at the comments that I actually got from LinkedIn. And actually it was via LinkedIn, because I had basically two kinds of responses. The first kind of response was yes, like it's silly to ask Japanese people to speak English. Oh, it's the same thing again, with people saying that, Japan needs to speak English, blah, blah, blah. And there are a lot of people who also recognize that, I was, just kind of to quote what some of the responses I got from the on the platform. Some people like mentioning that, I was one of probably many foreigners who were duped by Rakuten's English-only policy when I interviewed for them back in 2012. To my surprise, neither of two interviewers were actually able to speak it. And, other people kind of shared similar experiences. Whereas on the other hand, I also saw some comments saying that, we should applaud them for trying. They what else could they have done? If they needed to globalize, then this was one of the things that they needed to do. And other people also chipped in saying that, for example, Rakuten, they really needed to have this English policy because they didn't have enough technical workers, basically like software engineers and so on, and therefore they had to, basically get them from other countries. And to do that, then adopting English language policy would be the best way to integrate them into the company. So again, I think there is like a big spectrum of opinions coming from different, different sides of the topic. And, people, I think they make very good comments and very good points. I think it really depends, again, on what kind of company, what kind of industry you're coming from. For example, I think in a case like Rakuten, since, they work in a sort of basically technical field where, the skills are really not so much cultural and perhaps kind of more linked to, universalized programming skills, it does make sense to kind of, use English language as a sort of a company policy so that you can actually have access to the same talent pool that you're kind of competing with because, everyone uses English within the field of IT. Whereas if you're talking about, say, companies that are really quite export-driven or like manufacturing-based, and I think a lot of these companies, in Japan, we would refer to them as like makers or like manufacturers. I think a lot of these old traditional legacy companies, they still tend to be quite, in a sense, factory based. Like you're talking about people who have been working in the company for like 30 years, 40 years, and these are the people that really drive the company in the sense that they know the operations, they know how things work, and a lot of them are like old timers, and you can't expect them to be okay. Yeah, let's all go English like 2 years from now. And I think like most of them. I mean, thinking about the average age of Japan in general, it's creeping up every year. I think it's probably something like 40, over 40 right now. So we can imagine that at companies like these, the average age of people would be even higher. And I think it would be unrealistic for us to expect that they would be able to adapt to a English language policy. So I think it really depends on what kind of industry, what kind of company you're talking about. So that's for me, I think the first thing that we need to think about. And a lot of other questions that I think we need to think about are also kind of like where in the company, for example. So should the entire company mandate English, or should it be certain departments only? For example, like should we split the business into like global versus local, or like domestic departments? And I think again, people chipped in with like different comments saying that no, it's not really possible for Japanese companies that really want to kind of globalize. And I just kind of quote this person who commented, Jason Ball, I think. He said that the mix of departments, whether it's possible of global facing versus the domestic facing, has been the default solution for many decades. And so in that sense, it's not really new. And so he also kind of commented saying that outside of like IT, English was actually limited, but he thinks that there is no other way because in large Japanese companies that do want to globalize, it's not just possible for one department to adopt English. In fact, like the entire company has to move to sort of English language platform. So that was his opinion. So I don't have like a very good answer for this. So I think it would be great if we have a discussion on this point. Like, should the entire company globalize, or adopt English language as a sort of like a key language, or should this be limited to certain departments where it would make more sense from an efficiency standpoint, to actually do this. And I think we also need to think about who is affected. For example, by this I mean like it's not just employees that are affected, because I think, for example, just to give my own experience, if we kind of switch, if a Japanese company switches to English language, like mandates English language as the policy. So, like for example, if you're a supplier to this company, then you would also probably need to propose documents, for example, in English language. So it doesn't just affect the company itself, but also like the stakeholders of the company, suppliers, and so on. They would also have to adapt to some extent. And to what extent is this possible? I'm not very sure, because just to give the example of Rakuten again, I read this article from the Financial Times saying that one of the key reasons that Rakuten has been facing a lot of problems is that actually the suppliers themselves are having some difficulties working in English with Rakuten. So this is sort of like causing like delays and difficulties in communication and so on. So this could be one of the potential areas that I think a lot of people normally don't think about. They think about, it's just like English within the company, but then what about English outside of the company with suppliers, with stakeholders, with customers, and so on? I think this is something that I think needs to have a little bit more like discussion. And I think this is just not really talked about much. And then we need to also talk about what is actually being affected, or what kind of places, in what kind of areas do we see the impacts. So for example, like if let's say you have an English language mandate, does this mean that, okay, if this person doesn't speak English or like doesn't pass TOEIC or whatever within 2 years, is this person demoted, or is this person not going to become a manager? So I think we need to think about who wins, in a sense, who loses within this sort of English language mandate environment. So just to give an example, like old timer at this company who has been with the company for like 25 years, doesn't speak very good English, and then suddenly the company announces, okay, like from tomorrow we are going to have English language policy as our sort of company goal, and within 2 years, if you don't pass this level of attain this level of proficiency, you're going to be demoted or something. Then is that fair to this person? Because traditionally, I mean, like from a Japanese company standpoint of lifetime employment, this is not usually the case. I'm not saying that I mean, it always has to be the case. Of course, like change is a constant, but would that be fair to him, and would that be something appropriate for the company to do? I think these would be things that the company has to take in mind as well. And given that, okay, let's say they want to do this, then how should they do this? How should they roll out this English language implementation? I think this is also a big challenge, especially if the company is big and there are a lot of departments, there are a lot of documents that are all over the place. So how do you actually kind of implement this? How do you have, say, for example, two different sets of documents for basically what is the same operational manual, for example, because you would then need to update two languages at the same time, because we cannot expect that, okay, just because you got rid of just because you switched to English language as the mandatory company language, it doesn't mean that you stop using Japanese, because that's probably not going to be the case within a Japanese company, not within Japan, because in any case, a lot of government documents, legal documents, all of these will still be required to be produced in Japanese anyway. So I think you will need to keep two sets of documents, and then so that actually doubles the amount of work in a sense, like different departments need to do. So previously, while you're just making one set of documents, now you need to document it twice. So that again increases the operational workload. Would that be efficient for the company to do? So I think we really need to think about how large the company is. Is there a benefit to actually implementing English language? Is there not? So I think it has to be a holistic discussion, and not just like, okay, we want to globalize, so let's just do it anyway. I think a lot of things need to be considered before you implement a concept like us, like a policy like this. And I think finally, I think this is what I think a lot of comments also kind of talked about, was the idea of beyond language, what about culture? So just because you can speak English doesn't mean that you are able to communicate in a sort of efficient or effective manner, because like just talking about English spoken by Americans versus like English spoken by Europeans or like Asians is also quite different from the English spoken by Japanese, because we are all informed by where we're coming from our cultural background. So for example, even if like a Japanese person speaks fluent English, he might still use very traditional Japanese communication norms, by which I mean maybe like slightly ambiguous ways of communication, or like not really voicing out questions because of his preference to preserve the harmony, for example. Whereas in an American context, you would be expected to kind of raise questions and challenge people and so on. So I think we need to be aware of like where the culture is kind of influencing communication norms, and to what extent can you kind of ignore that, or like should we talk about culture as well in addition to just English? Because when you just mention like English, it sounds as if like English is going to solve everything, but it's not, and we know that. So I think we also need to talk about cultural knowledge and cultural awareness, and think that this has not really been talked about, or not talked about to the same extent as English. And I think this tends to happen because I think like if a company like Rakuten is the one like leading the discussion on English language adoption, then it tends to become quite universalized, because again, it's like a tech company, and tech companies tend not to talk so much about local culture versus like globalized norms of communication and so on. But again, that's just probably my take, and you might have a different vision or different way of thinking about this. So yeah, with that sort of setup, I think I would like to kind of hear from everyone. What is your own experience? What is your own opinion? And what is your take on this topic? Should Japanese companies adopt English as a mandatory language? And if they should, then how should they do it? Or do you think that they should adopt it to some extent, but not all the way? Or do you have some other like take on this? Like, no, they don't actually need to bother with this. What needs to happen is something else. I don't know. Could be some other policy, or could be some other action, or could be some other initiative that Japanese companies need to take in order for them to remain competitive in the next, say, 10 to 20 years or like 30 years. So yeah, it would be great to hear from everyone. I'm sure like we have very different opinions on this. And I'm looking forward to having a great discussion with all of you.
Oh, thank you very much, Alvin. I think you touched on all the key points, and I love the way you're making the conversation nuanced, because we all know that when theory meets reality, it's always very, very messy. And, it personally, I think it's interesting that what Rakuten did, especially because they were talking about their headquarters in Japan. Back in the mid 90s, I was dealing with Japanese companies in the US who instituted similar policies. And I could name the company because they weren't my client. But Toyota, back in the mid 90s, decided that their policy was that if there was a meeting and there was just one non-Japanese speaking person in that meeting, then the meeting had to be done completely in English. And I remember visiting Toyota with my Japanese boss at the time. I was working for Nori Skyokai. My Japanese boss couldn't speak any English. And because of the company, our company name, he was able to get a meeting with the then president of Toyota. And so we walk in, it's just the president, my boss, and me. And the president starts speaking English because I'm in the room. He didn't know I could speak Japanese. And my boss was like, couldn't understand anything. And so I spoke up in Japanese and I said, it's okay to speak Japanese. I understand it. And so the rest of the meeting was held in Japanese. I thought it was, I think there's some merit to pushing English when the company is in an English speaking country. But I also kind of believe, and you alluded to it, rather than looking at it in a binary way, like English or Japanese, which I think they're somewhere in the middle. I believe there's a common ground where you can do a hybrid version of it and still be effective, and probably more effective by doing the hybrid. So that's one point I just wanted to kind of raise, that I thought, I think you made a really good point. And I also directly felt in my job, and this is in the US, working between Japanese and Americans, that there are people who are good communicators, but they don't necessarily speak a foreign language. And as you implied, there are people who speak, I know Americans who speak excellent Japanese, but they offend people because they don't know the cultural rules of the road. So you could said another way, they know enough to be dangerous. And if I used to be asked quite a bit, if you have a binary choice of learning the language or the culture, which would you say is more important? And I firmly believe culture is much more important. If I had to pick one of the two, and of course, knowing both is ideal and optimum. And to that point, there were two kinds of interpreters that I encountered. Some were the technical, they were really good interpreters, but sometimes, how would I say this? Sometimes, if you want to be an effective communicator rather than just a straight interpreter, there should be a little bit of judicious laundering of what's said and adding a little bit into the conversation to give background that is unspoken. And that was always my approach, and some people criticized me for it. And the simplest example I could give is when I went out to the line one day with a Japanese technician, and he wanted to find out the root cause of a defect. He knew nothing about American culture and that operators being paranoid or blamed. And so he just goes out and says, hey, did the defect come from here? And if when I didn't know any better, I would just translate that, and they would get defensive, and then they wouldn't, want to be cooperative. And I quickly learned to say right away, I'd say, before I said anything, I'd say to the operator, first of all, he's not blaming you. If anything, he's blaming himself. He respects you. He wants you to know that, this is not your fault. And he just wants to know the root cause and invite you to help him fix the problem. So none of that would be spoken in Japanese to the operator, but just saying that up front made the conversation much easier. And that's just kind of a specific example of culture and how important it is. So those are just kind of off the top of my head, just some comments. And I know I didn't give you an answer, but I personally believe somewhere in the middle, there's a solution. And I think that's a really good discussion point to have as well.
Yes, indeed. And I also, if you allow me to say one thing, I believe that this happens not only in Japan, and this discussion has been had in other parts of the world as well, especially with cultures that are quite different from, let's say, the Western cultures and the values we share there. But because we are based in Japan, and we have seen it also often that some people, and of course some companies here, believe that if you speak the language, you will be fine. Well, it comes to show that basically the language is just not enough. And I remember when I started studying Japanese here, and when I first tried, to actually get my head around the different levels of politeness in the language, in the Japanese language, I felt overwhelmed and frustrated at points different times. And my teacher, my Japanese teacher at that time said, you don't have to worry that much about using, keigo perfectly. You need to show people that your heart is at the right place. And even if you make a mistake with the language here, if people know that you're sincere and you're there to help, everybody will respect your efforts. And I believe that it is true the other way around when it comes to English or other languages as well. So, Alvin, again, this is not really an answer to your question, but from my experience here in Japan, and I have been working for Japanese organizations only, it is like the application of foreign languages. It could be English, it could be any other foreign language, but it should be really selective. And once again, it should be adjusted to the work that the department or division does. Because people don't really, not everybody in a company needs to speak a foreign language to do their work well. And yes, again, the language is just a tool. It's a tool of communication. And as Tim said, it's so much more important to be well-versed in how people communicate and well-versed about what hasn't been said actually in the non-verbal communication. Because the language, the verbal language, somebody told me the other day that it's just 7% of our communication, and everything else remains unsaid or unspoken. So yeah, it should be, companies should be very careful when they decide where to use and how to adapt the foreign language as their communication language here in Japan. And also another point, Alvin, that you made is how such companies that decide to go all out with a foreign language, they disrupt their ecosystems as well. And it's interesting that you mentioned how Rakuten actually had difficulties because their suppliers and stakeholders, everybody along their value chain actually experienced those differences or difficulties because the company decided to adopt English as its official language. Well, but I'll stop here. And Frank, good morning. So thank you very much for coming up.
Good morning, Frank.
Hey, morning. And just to echo Tim's initial comments, Alvin, I love the way you've laid it out because, it's not a thing where there's a single answer and there are lots of ways of looking at this. And I think it's a great way to just get people to throw in their ideas. The way I look at it is, you've used the word, you've asked the question, should. And in my mind, I think, the answer to should is yes, absolutely. Japan should absolutely be, on all levels, not just companies, but all levels should be more aware of the need for them to communicate internationally, including English. But the will question is, will they do it? And the answer is no. It's really not going to happen, and it's because probably of a widespread. A lack of a widespread feeling of need to learn language. Japan works with Japanese, and unless there's a specific need for you to learn English, or unless you have a very strong interest in English, you're unlikely to do it. The other thing is, I don't think it's the job of companies to be doing this. This is a bigger problem. It's something that should be coming through the education system and other areas. Or it's not just companies' jobs to do it. And companies aren't the best way to do it, I think. The best entity to be responsible for this. Companies are not about raising the level of English language in Japan. Companies are about getting things done, about making profits. And so companies, I think, would make more rational decisions about how to approach English. And I think the way, in my own experience and just looking around, I think, most companies, they sort of do it in a two-tiered system where they have, there are some areas where you need near native English, and just talking of sort of really, extremes and simplifying the situation. But, you need those people in the international departments, the people who go overseas, and they really do need to be able to speak at a near native level. And you use interpreters and that as well to sort of cover where you need to. And then the other category is what I call English for special purposes. And that's people who really, really, need English on a day-to-day basis, but they're not naturally Englishly gifted in English. So, there might be an IT, there might be a specific job where they need that English. And then companies, tend to give them support to be able to communicate with their colleagues overseas if that's needed for the company to operate. So my view is what companies need to do is they need to continue. I think this two-tiered system is realistic for Japan. So my advice to any company would be to aim for something like that, but just do it better. Think of what's a better solution. Don't get an English school in to do classes at 8 o'clock in the morning, teaching your employees English that they're never going to use, but come up with a program that more specifically addresses the needs of individual employees, departments, and individual employees, is my thinking, just to throw it out there.
Yeah, thank you, Frank, for chipping in. And I think you made two very good points. I think the first one was that, the English language is not really the purview of Japanese companies, really. I think you alluded to this, but of course, like, English language is not something that you pick up at the age of, like, say 30 or even 40 or like even like say 20. I mean, it could be possible to pick up relatively good English skills from the age of, say, like 20, but once you get into the workforce at the age of 25, 30, you don't have the time to really commit to studying English. And as you get older, you have more commitments, and maybe, like, your brain is not as good as it used to be. I think it gets harder and harder for you to actually learn functional or like even English skills that would allow you to be able to communicate with foreign partners and foreign business associates. And I think you make a good point that I think education really needs to be improved, just like from a fundamental level and not just like across the country. And I think that this is one of the areas in which I think Japan does need a lot of work. But I think you point out that for Japanese companies, what they could do at this point, given the state of English language education, is having this sort of a two-tiered system in which you have you really like in which the first level really needs near native capability, and a second level could be having special requirements, and you give these employees some support. And I think this is a very sort of realistic and I think attainable way of doing it. And I think this could be one of the best and practical solutions for most Japanese companies out there. And I think probably we'll see this sort of a model become more adopted in the coming, say, 5 to 10 years. But that was just my thought on that. Thank you so much.
To that point, I really wish Japanese companies would place a higher value on native English speakers who are Japanese, and showing that value through salaries, good salaries, because I know so many talented Kikoku Shijo who lived overseas and they speak perfect English, and they don't seem to be valued as much as they should. So I think that would also be one, at least incremental step forward to tap into the talent that already exists and pay those people accordingly.
Yeah, I think that, yes, you're right. The number of those people is increasing. And actually, I have seen quite a lot of them. I mean, people in their 20s and early 30s who can speak English as their native language, or for that matter, even Spanish or French or German as well. But I think that, yes, you are right. At the moment, those skills are not actually perceived as necessary skills by many companies here. So they're much more, I believe that from my experience so far, it looks like they're valued, if I can say so, as technical skills, but not really as anything more than that. And I believe that with the labor shortage and with the realization of the country that it needs to go global if it really wants to maintain the level, that's the standard of living they have. So probably more appreciation will be given to those skills, but I don't expect that to happen anytime soon, actually, not in the next maybe 3 years, not at all. We'll see how it plays out, but yeah, it's how it is. Because, not the least, because Japan does take time to change, and such, changes just don't happen overnight. Sorry to interrupt you, Tim.
No. I was kind of clapping for you too. Yeah, and Frank, you made a good point. Is the will there? And if I were king and I were to do a long-term plan, I would institute language learning from kindergarten when the kids can learn it naturally. And one of the weak points of both Japan and my own country is we start teaching foreign language right when kids, right when they're in their early teens, right around the time where it becomes difficult to learn a language naturally. And so I find that to be a huge flaw. And if there really were the will, that would be the approach long term. There should be, of course, intermediate timing and short term approaches as well. And again, I don't think the will is there, unfortunately.
I think, Tim, I'd use the word sort of perceived necessity rather than the will. They don't need to. Japan works in Japanese, so why do you need to? I think that's a reality. And then sort of any solutions, that realistic solutions, have to be based on an acceptance of that reality, and then and then somehow move forward.
And if they accept the reality, then the will be there, correct? As a consequence of accepting the reality.
But the reality is that in general, Japan, doesn't need to learn English in the way that Korea does, where Korea has a small domestic market, and for Korean companies to grow, they have to go international. There's a real necessity there. That doesn't exist in Japan, or at least not to a level where people perceive it on a day-to-day basis, or government perceives it in a policy at a policy level, or companies perceive it as a necessity.
Yeah, I agree that the perception is not there, but I'm not sure I agree with Japan doesn't need it in a long-term sense, because there's a limit to their own market. And can companies continue to grow and survive without being able to scale globally?
Yeah,
that's another discussion.
You just make the distinction between need and perceived need. Yes, they need to, but do Japanese people and Japanese companies and the Japanese government perceive the need? I'd say the answer is no. At least no.
Yeah, fair point. Fair point. I agree.
Yes, indeed. And Steve, thank you for the comments. Yes, being told to do something has a different effect from incentivizing someone to do something. And once again, yes, it's about perception. I remember, I'm going back in time a little bit now, but I remember that, it's a personal story. So I have 2 nephews back home, and the older one, he really didn't like studying at all, and he never realized, or he never actually saw the need, to speak or to learn a foreign language up until my wedding day. And it's funny because at that point he was 13 years old. He had just become a teenager, and you know how teenagers really hate being told what to do. And then on that wedding day, so we had just about 50 people, come, and many of them came from different countries, actually, and everybody spoke English there. Some of them spoke Japanese. And the funny thing is that just that one day made my nephew change his mind, because he realized that if he really wanted to communicate with people coming from other parts of the world, he needed to speak a foreign language. And then it took him just 1.5 years to learn English to the level when he was fluent and he could communicate with almost anybody speaking English at that time. So, but for him, that one day did the trick. So, and to the point of, Frank saying that, yes, you have that need, but whether you perceive it as something that you need to do or not are 2 different things. So, yeah, how do you incentivize people And does everybody have to speak English really here? Because Japan works pretty well in Japanese as well. So yeah, that's a tough thing to decide. So the answer is not a blanket one. We need to appreciate the fact that some companies do need to use foreign languages because they work globally, but others are just fine, doing business here in Japan. And many of those companies are never going global, actually. So that's what it is at the moment.
And how do you incentivize? Because that's a really good point within the context of a company. There's obviously pay, although some people might argue that isn't necessarily a sufficient incentive. Sometimes it's saying, okay, in 2 years, we're sending you overseas, and, you have 2 years to bone up on your English or whatever language, the country that you're going to. Those are the only two thoughts that just popped into my head, but those are questions that have to be asked for a company, I believe.
Yes, they have to be asked, and also we need to think that the answers to those questions will depend on the company, and if the company has enough resources to outsource the translation of their, let's say, the documents written in Japanese so that they can be translated into English, and they can have just a few people who are fluent in the language, well, that's okay too. And well, if they have, like in the company I worked for until recently, well, there were enough resources for the chairman, actually, to outsource the simultaneous translation, to the point that he had a favorite interpreter, and they would fly that interpreter from the United States to Japan, and back whenever the chairman needed her. So as long as the company has the resources to do that, oh, that's okay. I don't see any problems with that either. Yeah, but, well, the answer really depends on what company we are talking about, the business of that company, the industry, and everything else. Yes, let me see. Steve, thank you for the comments. Yes, the current lack of new engineers in Japan, highly valued by companies, but compared to other countries, notably undercompensated. Yeah, that's true. But at the same time, I think that the undercompensated skills are not only those of the IT engineers here, but more or less of quite a few of the people working in other industries, because that's the level of the wages here in Japan. So, and this is another thing. It's a structural issue, I believe, that the country will need to deal with. Yes. Yeah, the same goes for bilinguals. Absolutely agreed with that. Yeah.
And I think that goes back to Frank's point of perceived value. If it's not there, why compensate in their minds? Indeed,
yes. But also on a different level, think about it. If the company doesn't see, the value of having bilingual staff, if it doesn't translate to the bottom line of the company at the end of the day, there is no need for the company to value those skills. So the question is, what is the use for the company of, let's say, the skills of bilingual staff, the skills of IT engineers, and so on and so on. And we know that the value is there. The question is how it translates, on their financial documents as well.
Yes, I agree. I think intuitively we believe it has value, but how do you make that logical connection on paper to the bottom line, to profit? That's a challenge. Same with culture. Same with understanding culture.
Yes, it is indeed. But I think that, yes, with culture, it's even more difficult.
Yes.
Because it is intangible. And while the language is, any language is intangible too, but still, if somebody speaks it or doesn't, then at some point there are those aha moments when the management realizes, yeah, we need people who speak that language. But with culture, it's probably more difficult because of those subtle differences, and yeah, once again, it's not written.
Yes, and as an example, when Japanese companies first came to the U.S., it was very difficult for me to sell my intercultural services. And then they were there a few years, so they thought they could solve the problem with interpreters, and that didn't work. There was still disharmony within the company, and it took them several years before many companies realized, okay, it's deeper than language. They had to muddle through and fail on many levels before they would even consider entertaining the idea that it might have value. Eventually, I got my foot in many doors, but they had to work their way through the pain before they realized something was amiss other than just language.
Yes, and then I think that the flops, do you call them that? The failures actually are much deeper if there are cultural mismatches within the company, and also company and partners and so on. But yes, so Steve, trial by fire, open Japan market to more international competition, force companies to fight. Well, I wish that could be done, but once again, if you have been here for a while and you know how the government actually works and how the public policies are made, you probably know that opening the country, and its industries at a go is not going to happen. And there are some strategic industries here that are not going to see so many foreign companies either. So yeah, it's like, where is change, how it happens, and what part of the economy or which industry we're talking about also plays a big part in it.
Here's just an interesting question to throw out there. What would have to happen for Japan to see the light? In other words, what would be the international competition, so-called black ships, that would make the Japanese say, uh-oh, you know what, we better do something? I don't know the answer. I'm just throwing the question out.
Yeah, I would appreciate some opinions from the Japan hands in the room. It doesn't have to go that way. It could be the reverse. What do you mean, Steve, by that?
Yeah, if you can come up on stage, Steve, please. Thank you.
Yeah, typing on the keyboard was not fun. I was just thinking. So it doesn't have to be forcing something into Japan. It can actually be the reverse. It could be Japan going out again, like it did in the 70s and in the 80s. If Japanese companies have a more successful record of going abroad, competing in the global marketplace, pushing out Japanese, Japanese, Japan has had unicorns. They can actually project again and, rebuild Sony style appreciation for Japanese things, but would require, of course, that you have a lot of people who speak Farsi. You've got a lot of people who speak English, a lot of people who speak Chinese. You've got to globalize their own workforce to basically leave Japan and go and hunt for new markets and go and penetrate new opportunities and bring that money back to Japan. Then it would be valued like it was back in the 70s. What happened was, I feel that they just felt that they had enough, and then they locked the doors and they stopped doing that. One way is to let people in and to just kind of beat Japanese companies with competition until they basically beg for mercy and start fighting back on their own turf. But I think probably the more palatable solution would be to convince the Japanese to really fight for that global market, like most of the other Asian countries have been doing for the last 30 years.
Yeah, my memory, and again, I got to go back and look at it, but there were certain policies that incentivized the Japanese to go abroad and, for example, build their plants overseas. And at the time, it was the U.S. because that was the hot market. And so some of it was out of necessity. And so in a sense, they had no choice. So there were built-in incentives, as well as, like, the company I worked for at the time was a Nissan supplier. and they didn't want to go overseas. But because of these policies and because Nissan insisted they be there, they went there kicking and screaming. So what was the incentive, and what would be the incentive now to do what you say, Steve?
Well, unfortunately, I mean, there are companies that do it. You look at Rakuten, and it has continued. But the difference is, a lack of success, first of all. Failure after failure after failure. They come back with their tails between their legs and just leave a nasty taste for everyone in the company. And it just de-incentivizes people to participate in stuff like that. They need to actually eventually find success. Like I said, Sony, they can do what Sony did back in the 70s, back in the 80s, then there's going to be more people wanting to do that, more companies willing to risk and wanting to have the manpower and the skills necessary to do that. They have not found the formula yet for going abroad and getting success. They have a lot of examples of failure, and that is paralyzing. SoftBank, poor SoftBank, again, is racking up the L's, and it's really harmful for that long-term prospect. Rakuten as well, probably many more losses than wins. And when they do win, it's not well publicized. It doesn't become like the big thing. It just becomes, okay, yeah, we managed to get a foothold somewhere. The telecom market, they all basically lost horribly, painfully in the newspapers every day. They need to find opportunities, and that's where I don't have the answer. This is where I think a lot of energy should be putting on finding that answer. That's the easy ladder for the future of Japan, is to find those opportunities, and the government involvement, pushing it, incentivizing it. Regulating it, helping with regulations, helping with immigration and other required aspects. And basically, until you start seeing the W's, it's really going to be tough.
Why do you, Steve? Why do you think the Monozukuri, the manufacturing companies, succeeded for the most part? Most of them, not all of them. Obviously that's Japan's Tokui. That's one of their strengths. They somehow made it happen. And now as you said, these other companies, the newer ones, have not had that success. Any theories on that?
Well, I mean, the Monozukuri, the production companies, your Sonys, Toyotas, a lot of it was good timing. Products at a point when Japan could sell them and make money at a very good, affordable level. There was a growing demand, so they were in the right place at the right time with the right resources. And like I said, that's kind of luck. Can't really count on that, and it's definitely not the same thing now. The positions are reformatted, and the competition is completely different. The new competition, when you look at the other countries in Asia, everybody is ahead. Everybody is faster at this game right now. So Japan needs to figure out where the next step is, get in there. They blew it with engineering, particularly with software and network engineering, by, again, not really investing in those sectors, not really investing in those people. And that's why there's a big dearth of engineers in Japan right now. And that, again, even if they try right now, they're way behind everybody else in the region. There are new areas of growth. Fintech is an area where Japan is moving ahead and has quite a few, and that's where all the unicorns are right now in Japan. But it's a high risk area. I guess maybe you just gamble with it. And it's, again, there's no guarantee of success. If there was, it wouldn't be that fun. But if they don't play the game, then they won't win.
And I think that another factor here is that life is really comfortable. It's comfortable even for the people, who are in the, just below, the middle class and, those wages and so on. Because, if you have food on your table and if you have a place to live, for many people, I'm not saying that it's the same for everyone, but for quite a few people, it's actually enough. And that ambition of getting the country to a better place, getting your family to a better place. It has been actually it has mellowed down to a certain extent. And you know that, well, you don't have to try that hard, actually, at work or to be that innovative in order to secure a certain level of comfort here. I think that's one of the biggest obstacles for the nation to get over. Because, there is certainly, let's say, a generation of younger entrepreneurs who are very active, who are very ambitious. But the number of those entrepreneurs, the startup owners, is still very small. And I believe that probably something in the educational system here needs to change so that the next generations are actually more ambitious when it comes to innovation.
Yeah, if I may just chip in, I think we are kind of running out of time anyway. But I think you're right that historical context is completely different. So in the 60s and the 70s, I think Japan was still rebuilding from after the war, and I think that there was this fire in a sense to really, if they couldn't conquer the world, then at least they could conquer the world economically. And I think there was a lot of the impetus that was driving Japan as a sort of manufacturing powerhouse. And I think that has been sort of replaced by, in recent years, China, but then you also see other Asian countries catching up to that. And I think a lot of that has to do with, economic incentive, as you kind of point out. And I think even now, even as, I just saw a report from the Nikkei saying that I think annualized GDP fell by a few points, I think 1.2% in the third quarter. I think even though the economy is sort of is stagnating and probably is going to be the case for the next couple of years, I think that in general, I think most people still have a decent standard of living. Even with lower than middle class income, you can afford to have relatively good food on your table, and you don't go homeless and so on. So I think we are kind of missing the economic incentive to really go out there and sort of risk it, as Steve puts it. And I don't know if conditions would be right again for that to happen, say in 10 to 20 years, because now we kind of see I think this would be a separate discussion, but the geopolitics of the world have shifted dramatically in the last 2 to 3 years. For example, I don't know what's going to happen with with Russia. Not sure what's going to happen with China. China seems to be disengaging from the world. So I think there is this huge opportunity there for Japan to actually make a comeback, so to speak. And I don't know if the government or Japanese companies would be able to risk and take the risk and really try again in the next 10 to 20 years. I think that could be the window of opportunity for Japan. And even for inbound tourism, we saw how Japan really suffered economically in the last 2.5 years with the whole COVID borders being closed, and now you see reports of there not being enough people to work. So I think the factors seem to be kind of the stars seem to be aligning for this sort of economic incentive to actually happen, and I think we might not be very far from that future. So that's just my take on it.
Yes, thank you, Alvin, and I agree with you, definitely. So let's see, hopefully that change and then that alignment will be completed sooner than later. So, it's almost 9 o'clock, and I want to let everybody go actually around their day. It's Wednesday, it's a working day here, and I'm sure that we'll be continuing this conversation in the future because things will be changing and historical context is very important. Alvin, again, thank you very much for agreeing to be our guest today. Frank and Steve, thank you for coming up on stage and sharing your perspectives. It's very important to have a discussion here. Of course, please join us again in future conversations. We'll be here once again next Wednesday morning at 8 o'clock. So we're looking forward to having you once again, sharing your experience. Yes, thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you, everybody, for coming. I appreciate everyone coming up on stage. It was a great discussion, and I hope we can continue it in future rooms.
Definitely so. Have a great day and a successful reminder of the week, and be with us again next Wednesday. Thank you. Thank you for tuning in today. We will be on air next week on Wednesday at 8 a.m. Japan time again, so join us. Until then, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel. If you want to stay informed about our upcoming events, follow us on Clubhouse, LinkedIn, or Twitter. Again, we are looking forward to your joining us next week. Until then, stay well and make the best of the day. See you!